When we speak of an in-service group, we're talking about any collection of CES leaders and teachers gathered for the purpose of improvement. For example, an area director is typically included in a number of in-service groups with a variety of assignments or needs. Coordinators, institute directors, and seminary principals also lead in-service groups for people in a variety of assignments with diverse needs. Whatever the group, the principles and the process we will discuss today are universal and can help us provide the right training and do so in the right way. The preparation, implementation, and evaluation process of training includes 5 elements. First, assess needs. Second, determine what to train. Third, determine how to train. Fourth, implement the training. And last, evaluate the training. Brothers Anderson and Monson will now take some time to share some of the principles for each of these elements of the training process, beginning with assess needs. Brethren?
Thank you, Brother Moore. Let me begin by comparing the training process to constructing a building or house. A trained and licensed contractor will never attempt to build or improve a structure without first conducting an assessment. He must survey the lot or field, determine its size and measurements, gain an understanding of the soil and geological elements. He must also study the surrounding environment and know the codes and standards that will influence the placement of the structure and signal the correct materials to use in the construction process. Without this assessment, the performance and product will fall far short of the desired result. In providing training, we should also assess the needs of those we serve as we construct our training house. Before we decide the what and how of our training, we must assess and understand the many things that are involved with the personnel in our in-service groups. A principle stated in our handbook says, as individuals, leaders, and councils prepare training, they must first decide what principles or skills should be addressed, based on assessment. We have standards in CES on which we base our assessment. These standards not only govern our assessment in providing training, but are the foundation pillars for providing feedback in interviews and exchanges. Assessment is the process of evaluating or appraising based upon a standard. Assessment includes measuring knowledge, understanding, performance, actions, attitudes, feelings, or character, attributes, by comparing what is expected with actual achievement. Unless we have a clear understanding of where we want to be, the expectation, and then evaluate where we are currently, the performance, we will certainly miss the mark in constructing our house. This idea is illustrated in this diagram, which shows the gap we seek to identify between expected performance and actual performance. As in-service leaders, we work at identifying what gaps there are, and then we go to work at closing them. Another idea that is helpful for in-service leaders is to remember, when assessing the needs of their in-service group, as found in Teaching the Gospel, a resource for teaching improvement materials, under the section Planning Guide, in-service leaders are taught, an in-service leader must prayerfully identify, consider, and prioritize teachers' needs. One way to identify these needs is to ask, what problems are these teachers facing? Another way is to consult with teachers and ask, what areas would you like help with? Because some needs are more serious or urgent than others, in-service leaders will need to prioritize them. By applying these ideas, an in-service leader is much more likely to provide the right training. Brother Valinga, with your in-service group, will you take a few minutes to analyze these principles and to discuss their application in a variety of CES assignments?
Thanks, Brother Anderson. Well, brethren, it's good to be with you today. We've just had these principles of assessment defined for us quite well. So I have a question. Why are you feeling that assessment is so important for us to do as we prepare training?
You know, if If I could just draw that diagram one more time on the board so we could look at it here. Brother Anderson showed the diagram, then this top was, sorry about that, expectations. There was a coming through here, and actual achievement being right here, and then each aspect of the commission was listed down here. Live, teach, and administer. I think what he said was that this is what's expected of our teachers and leaders, and if their actual performance is somewhere in this range, that there exists a gap here, and that's what we train to. Is that what he said? I think that's what he said.
I believe that as well. Brother
I
Webb?
think the reason assessment matters so much, though, is because we have a number of people that we're training, and each of them are on a different level, depending on what we're trying to train. If we took an element of the teaching emphasis and said, in my area, I have different people and different levels of understanding or performance with that category of the teaching emphasis. And if I don't assess, if I just assume that everybody's in one point, and I have a teacher that's right here, and I assume that he's here, and I try to train to move him from here to here, when really the improvement would be a large step for him, that would be frustrating to him, and he would maybe become discouraged or frustrated that he couldn't make the step that I'm asking him to make. On the other hand, if a teacher really was here and I assumed he was down here, and I'm trying to train to get him here, then that would be frustrating because my assessment was wrong and I wouldn't be dealing with the needs that he actually had.
Those are excellent observations. So how do you begin this assessment process? What do you do? Brother Vallis?
I think our Administering Appropriately handbook answers it nicely on page 31.
Okay, let's all turn there, shall we?
It gives great things that really work.
What page are you on?
31,
Okay.
on the right side under How to Assess. Assessment of leaders and teachers can be conducted through such means as spiritual discernment, classroom observations, formal assessment instruments, student surveys and that type of thing, informal exchanges and interviews, and that can be with students, teachers, priesthood leaders, and even parents. And I think all of those things are great ways to assess.
Thanks, Brother Vallis. Brother Lotulele?
Yeah, I believe that a good reminder is that, as mentioned by Brother Anderson, is that assessment in CS is based on standards. And our standards are found in the standard works, the words of the prophets, and in CS approved materials. And one way to really focus on these would be to look at the basic duties and responsibilities approved by CES, where they identify certain duties and responsibilities under our commission, which is to live, to teach, and to administer. So that would be a way to help in-service trainers.
Good. Are you all familiar with where those basic duties and responsibilities are? Brother Webb, can you tell us where we can find those?
It's toward the end of the Administering Appropriately handbook. There's a page, an appendix with that title. It's page 39.
Okay, thank you. It's very important for us to know where those are and refer to them often, isn't it? Now, can any of you give me some examples of how you've utilized these elements effectively in your training?
Just to comment on what Mark said, Mark talked about all of the different means of assessment, that we shouldn't rely just on one in particular. I remember as a coordinator, we had a stake supervisor in a particular stake, and I would go and visit a class and kind of observe the teacher and watch what was happening there, try to observe the students, and afterwards communicate a little bit with priesthood leaders. Then the stake supervisor would go in. She would assess what was going on. She would then send a follow-up email to the teacher with a couple of areas that she thought that the teacher did well on, and a thought or two about some ways that they could improve, and copy me. And as we were able to plan, as in-service came up in the coming weeks, I was able to take a look at that and all the other teachers in that stake using multiple means and really make at least we tried to make a decent assessment about where people were relative to the expectation. That worked out.
Excellent example. Why is it so important for us to stay with these core training documents we've been given that were identified by Brother Anderson?
I think sometimes an in-service trainer may come and go with changing assignments, but our handbooks give us just a solid foundation that we always can refer to and have, confidence in the teachings there.
That's good. Could we all turn to page 31 of the Administering Appropriately Handbook? There's another important thing, I think, for us to remember as we assess. If you'll notice at the bottom of the right-hand column, in the last paragraph, it says some areas of assessment are easier to measure than others. Star, could you just follow along with that and identify those, please?
Well, such as students' enrollment, attendance, and course completion, a teacher's accuracy and timeliness of reports, or a leader's timely acquisition of operating materials and supplies. Many other important duties and responsibilities are more difficult to measure, such as a student's willingness to live what is taught, a teacher's effectiveness in teaching by the Spirit, or a leader's empathy for those he or she serves. Therefore, in addition to formal measures, assessment in CES is often conducted through informal exchanges.
Has any of you had an experience with that where it's been difficult for you to identify that difference of the easy things versus the difficult things? Brother Webb, I see a smile.
I don't really have an experience to share. I just, there are some things that we can chart. We can tell the number of enrollment, and we can see improvement if enrollment increases. But, as I go out and watch classrooms and try to assess things like, is this teacher teaching by the Spirit? That's a hard thing to measure. When we talk about outcomes in students' lives and those kinds of things, those are hard things to measure. And so we just have to be very close to the Spirit, be sensitive to all the information and different ways that we receive it. And just prayerfully consider those things. Some of those things aren't just statistical, and we just have to be very sensitive to be led by Heavenly Father and make those kinds of assessments.
That's well said. Being sensitive to and identifying. I hope that we pay close attention to what we've been taught here in these principles and clearly assess based on the expectations we've been given on the expectation, the actual performance, and where the gap is before we decide what it is we train. Thanks, Brother Webb. Did you have
Just
another
quickly,
comment?
one other thought about this idea that we make sure that it's standards. I think there's a blessing in doing it that way. When we leave, we can't be there every day to watch the progress of a teacher. And if we base it on a standard rather than a personal opinion, we can hand them the handbook and say, here's the expectation. Let's talk about how both of us feel about where you are on your level of meeting this expectation. Let's set some goals, and then I can leave you with that instruction, and you can do some self-assessment and come back to those core materials. I just think for me, if I ever, as a person giving feedback, if I ever find myself saying, I would have done it differently, then that's not very helpful. But if I say, here's the standard, let's work together to help you meet it, I just think that's much more helpful.
Very good. Thank you, brethren.
Thank you, Brother Valinga. Brother Monson?
Brother Anderson, after assessing the needs of an in-service group, we're better prepared to determine what needs to be trained. Using our building and contractor example, deciding what to train after you've assessed the needs of your group might be likened to a builder who, after surveying the ground and discussing the needs of the client, creates a drawing or a blueprint which would set forth what is to be built on the property or what is to be modified. Our handbooks teach this idea this way. An important function of an in-service leader is to identify which principles to focus on in training so that teachers' assessed needs will be met. In other words, as in-service leaders, we identify what needs to be addressed in our group so that our training efforts will help us meet the needs of our students. There's an additional clarification for the Administering Appropriately handbook, wherein we read this. Training is based upon what is emphasized in the standard works by the Church Board of Education and other church leaders, by CES administration and in CES materials such as handbooks, manuals, guides, and other correspondence. Training in CES focuses on principles doctrines, abilities, and skills associated with the objective, commission, and basic duties and responsibilities. Now notice that we're to provide training in principles, doctrines, abilities, and skills, and that in addition to locally assessed needs, the decision of what to train are based upon what is emphasized by our leaders and based in church-approved resources. Also remember that before we can decide the how, or what we'll be actually doing in our meetings, we need to determine whether we will be providing training in principles and doctrines, or if we'll be helping our in-service group develop needed skills. Now, quite often it'll be a mixture of both of these things, but the difference between training for principles and training for skills is a critical one because it determines the kind of activities that we'll prepare. Now, there's an important tool that has been prepared for use in deciding what to train. As mentioned by our in-service group, the appendix for our Administering Appropriately handbook, there's a page titled Some Basic Duties and Responsibilities. Again, here's listed many things that CS teachers and leaders are involved in on a daily basis, and that we as in-service leaders can assist others to improve. This part of the handbook is a good place to start when deciding the what, or the content of the training. And now using this list, an in-service leader can match the group's needs with the appropriate duties and responsibilities, and then be better prepared to provide the training that will help improve performance. Now, Brother Valinga, will you spend a few minutes with your group discussing this idea of determining what is to be trained?
Thanks, Brother Monson. Be happy to. Now, brethren, where do we find those basic duties and expectations? Again, Brother Vallis?
You know, as you measure the gap after you've assessed, there may be many gaps you want to address and many needs and sometimes limited time to have your in-service training. So for me, I think one of the most important aspects is to be very prayerful and ask for our Father in Heaven's help in directing what we should teach first.
Okay, thank you. Brother Webb?
I just really appreciate that answer. I was just thinking of, last February when Elder Scott spoke to us, he asked us specifically to pray to find ways to better lock truth into the hearts and minds of our students. And I just wonder how many of us have actually offered that prayer, both as teachers and as trainers, to find out what it is. I think what he said, and paraphrasing, but that we would get different answers. For all the people who offered that prayer, it would be maybe a different answer of how and what needed to be trained. I think also just quickly, 2.5 years ago, I guess it was, when Elder Irene said that we need to do better. He said, the way that we will do better, the Lord will require of us what He's always required. We will have to have the Spirit guide us. We'll have to respond to the promptings of the Spirit. And the way that will come is that we will offer the prayer of faith. And so I'm just seconding what Mark said. I think it's not a token effort in prayer or just lip service to have the Spirit in this process. We have to offer a prayer of faith and really plead with Heavenly Father to know how to lock truth into the hearts of our students, including if those students are teachers.
Excellent. Those are key elements when we've assessed the need and need to determine our training. Brother Fillmore?
Along those lines, Brother Anderson, Brother Monson have talked about a training house. This isn't a house, but Nephi was asked to build a ship. And you remember, can I just read this? Would that be all right?
Please.
In 1 Nephi 18, just the first couple of verses, I think this really paints the picture of what Brother Webb defined here. It says, "It came to pass, they did worship the Lord, and did go forth with me, and we did work timbers of curious workmanship. The Lord did show me from time to time after what manner I should work the timbers of the ship." Remember this?
Yeah.
"And now I, Nephi, did not work the timbers after the manner which was learned by men. Neither did I build the ship after the manner of men. I did build it after the manner which the Lord had shown unto me, wherefore it was not after the manner of men." And then just to echo this, "I, Nephi, did go into the mount oft. I did pray oft unto the Lord, wherefore the Lord showed unto me great things." I think that as we offer that prayer of faith, as we try to build this training house, that the Lord will show us great things and help us to determine what we ought to focus on among the myriad of things that we could.
Thank you. I have a testimony of that. As I was reviewing some scriptures just this morning, I thought of the many times the Lord has shown different prophets, different of His children, ways to build what He's asked them to build. Well, how is training different from teaching, brethren?
There's a definition. It's on page 33 of the Administering Appropriately Handbook that simply says that teaching usually is the acquisition of knowledge, but training refers to instruction that moves beyond acquiring knowledge to improving abilities.
Excellent. Excellent, Mark. Brother Dallas?
I was thinking of our TIP resource manual, the blue one.
Mm-hmm.
On page 1, there's a great chart. Maybe I can draw it on the board quickly.
Please. Would you like me to?
Oh, I can draw it over here,
Okay.
I think.
Okay.
It's just a pie chart, and it has the different components of an in-service that you can use. And it has teaching improvement, should be half of that, and content mastery here, and the administrative business here. And, you know, I'm a little guilty, I'm afraid. If I think of some of the in-services that I've been involved with and conducted, often the administering the business, you get bogged down and you end up taking a lot more time there, or even the content as you work on a certain block of scripture or chapters. And they can sometimes take this very important time that we should teach how to teach, the teaching improvement. And I think this is a great chart to remember as we plan those in-services, to keep that half secure, where we can help our teachers there.
Excellent example. Again, where did you find that?
This is in the tip manual, the teaching improvement package, page 1.
Page 1. Good. Good. Brother Lou.
Just a thought that came to me about when Brother Monson discussed the importance of teaching principles. Throughout the world, we have cultures and languages and styles, but the important thing about principles are that they are true and they cross over, they transfer. Maybe as you consider the needs and abilities of your group, you may be able to adapt or change the approaches and further for application, but principles cross over to all in-service group, and that's why they're very important to note.
Excellent, thank you. Can any of you think of any scriptural examples of these principles that we're talking about? We just have a couple of minutes.
That's a good question. I guess we can't.
You know, in the New Testament, there were often times when it's probably not as, well, Jesus would often look at his audience before he decided what to teach them. It was a different message that he gave to his disciples as opposed to what maybe he would give to the Pharisees, because the audience was different. And so he would have maybe assessed what they needed to hear and then made a determination in his own mind about what he would go to teach them. And that's one I could think of, maybe.
Can you think of times when the Lord has helped one who's leading know what to teach? Brother Webb?
The examples both in the New Testament and in the Book of Mormon, when he teaches his apostles and says very clearly what they're to teach and to say none other thing than what he's taught them. He's very clear in his instruction there. So.
Thank you. I know that the Lord can help us as when we've done all of the assessment that we need to do and knowing the standards, He can help us know what it is we need to teach. Thanks, brethren.
Thanks, brethren. Those great insights. Now, following the model that Brother Moore outlined, after deciding what principles or skills need to be addressed, the next step is for the in-service leader to really decide how to best provide training for his or her group. As we said earlier, before an in-service leader can decide the type of activities to be used, he or she must first decide what it is to be trained. Will I be providing training in principles or doctrines, or is skill development more of what is needed? Or more likely than not, will I be using a combination of these 2? Now, once this has been decided, the decisions about how to train are much easier. If an in-service leader isn't careful, he or she might be tempted to think they could just teach a great lesson in hopes that the group will get it or figure out how to improve. Or that if we just tell them our concerns and what skills they need to develop, then they'll immediately know how to correct and improve. Now, as you know, those of you who provide training, both of these approaches have fatal flaws. Consider what is taught in the Administering Appropriately Handbook as it relates to training principles or skills. Effectively addressing principles or doctrines in training generally includes such elements as defining, illustrating, analyzing, applying, and reporting progress. Now, notice the difference if the content is more focused on skill development. Effectively addressing skills or practices in training often includes defining, modeling, practicing, providing feedback, incorporating into one's assignment, and reporting progress. These elements of effective training are crucial, especially those that come later in each list. We've asked Brother Villing and his in-service group to help us distinguish between providing training based on principles and providing training based on skills, and then to talk about each one. Brother Villing. What is with the hat?
Well,
Nice hat.
I just want to be like Brother Iba when I grow up. Well, you said we've got to use certain tools, right?
Indeed we do.
Well, if I'm teaching a principle, I've got some tools for that. If I'm trying to teach some skills, I've got some tools for that.
You've got some fun tools there.
They're fun. They're fun. In fact, you'll notice I've made my mistakes. But it would really be unwise for me to take that nail and try and put it in with that. So, brethren, let's talk about that, shall we? Shall we?
You look great.
Okay. So why is it so important to distinguish between whether we're going to train a principle or a skill?
Can I draw on the board again?
Sure. Brother Fillmore, you're a good artist.
Yeah. One way to look at it might be like this. As we go down the trail of training, if you will, there comes a point right here where we need to make a decision about if we're going to be training a principle with that set of tools on that side, or if we're going to be training a skill. One of the reasons we need to make that determination is because the way we train a principle is different from the way that we train a skill. As Brother Monson mentioned there, some of the elements of effectively training principles are to define it, to analyze it, to illustrate it, to apply it, and then as we go along, we report our progress of how we've applied what's going on. That's on the principle side, right?
Yes.
That's on down in the lower right-hand corner, page 33. Then as we go to skills, we have a different set of tools on the other side of your belt, right? We have here define, model, practice. Somebody watches our practice and provides us with feedback. Then we try to incorporate it into our assignment and then report our progress, right? So it's very important to decide if we're training a principle or if we're training a skill. What happens sometimes is because we love the gospel and we love to teach principles and doctrines, sometimes we tend to teach everything. Have you had that happen? As if it's a principle. We define and we analyze and we illustrate and we talk about it and we do all these things and then we run out of time to be able to really focus on if it's a skill or not. We run out of time to practice. So if that's helpful.
That's very helpful. But how do we determine if it's a principle or a skill?
One of the ways maybe to determine if it's a principle is to, for example, if we took the importance of asking questions. Notice I took the phrase, the importance of. Generally speaking, if we can take a training topic and put the words the importance of in front of it, generally speaking, that helps us to go down this road, training of a principle. If we took questions and said how to ask important questions, putting the words how to in front of the training topic might lead us down this way. Now we know, as Brother Monson indicated, that some of these elements will be used in combination with each other, but did that make sense? The importance of and how to. That's one way to do it.
Does that make sense to you, brethren? Can anyone add?
Just a quick analogy. As Brother Fillmore was talking, I was thinking training's a little like coaching, and I coach we just finished a season of 9-year-old girls basketball. My daughter plays and about 8 other girls. And if I went to their practice and put them on the bleachers and said, okay, for the first half hour, let's read the rule book. And then for the last half hour, let me tell you about all the games I played in. First of all, none of them would come back. And secondly, if they did, they would never improve. I guess what I'm trying to say is if we want skill development, skill acquisition, they have to have time to practice. Same thing with this circle here. I think sometimes, at least me, I'm guilty of this. I'll stand up and define and illustrate and give examples for 50 minutes and say, oh, we need some practice time, and oh, we're out of time. And if my goal is to help them acquire skills, then I need to plan practice time for them in that training session.
That's key. Thank you. Brother Webb, Brother Vallis?
Something that was helpful for me to see the difference between a principle and a skill was just in our Teaching the Gospel table of contents. Just in the table of contents, on the left-hand side, all of those seem to be principles. And in the right-hand column, it even says skills, gospel teaching skills for effective teaching. And it lists several skills, and I think as our core documents here again help us identify and spell out the differences between the two. That can be helpful to see examples.
Excellent, excellent. Brother Lotulele.
One thing that is helpful to me as an in-service leader is to use the Teaching the Gospel, CS training resource for teaching improvement, and look at pages 5 and 6, which itemize teaching principles that you could refer to. And on page 6, the teaching skills for effective teaching. That it's been helpful to me to be able to identify or to clarify the topics and which way I will go as far as training.
Thank you. Do any of you have an example of how we can differentiate between those?
There's one that occurs to me. It might be a negative example, but I think sometimes the one that occurred to me is the idea of readiness. The Teaching the Gospel Handbook says readiness is a condition of the heart and the mind. It's a principle, really. It's the idea that a student is ready to be taught and that they accept their role in the learning process. So sometimes we teach that as a skill instead of understanding the background, the principle behind if a student's ready to have his heart written on today. There are other skills, of course, that are part of readiness. You could learn readiness activities. Sometimes we jump right to, though, readiness is an object lesson or readiness is a good story or whatever, and it is an activity to improve readiness, but readiness itself is the condition of the student, and that's, I guess, a principle. But if we wanted to help them understand the skill, then we would need, again, some time to practice storytelling or object lessons or whatever the activity is. But before we get there, I think they need to understand what the principle is. Why do we want a student to be in a condition of readiness before we try to teach?
That is an excellent example. Brother Fillmore?
You know, just using that as an example, if I were trying to plan an in-service training meeting about that, using this model, I might think, okay, so readiness is a principle. Therefore, I need to spend some time defining and illustrating and analyzing a little bit, but then maybe I could jump to now that I've laid a foundation, jump to an opportunity to give them time to actually practice that. And in planning such a meeting, we might think in our minds, okay, if it's a 1-hour meeting, I need a half an hour of practice time, practice and feedback time. Therefore, I only have a half an hour to do the other part. And so often, as we talked about, is we spend so much time in the define and illustrate and analyze portion that we never get time to practice. So to plan your meeting, determining if it's a skill, will automatically cause you to reduce the amount of time that you spend defining, illustrating, and analyzing, and spend sufficient time in practice.
Brethren, that's excellent. That's excellent to remember. Now let's think of any scriptural examples of what we're talking about. Did you read your scriptures this morning, brethren?
I think there's a lot of examples in Scripture where Jesus teaches principles. He just expands people's vision and understanding. He uses all kinds of means to do that. He uses analogies and objects and lots of ways to teach principles. I think there's also some times, like with the call of the 70 in the New Testament, where they come back and report their stewardship, and He's asked them to do some specific things and go out and practice what He's taught them, and to come back and report on that, and then He gives them more to work on and to improve. And it's something they're doing, not just something they're understanding.
Thank you. We witnessed an in-service in our area where very well-prepared training was given by one of the faculties, where within 1 hour they were able to, by being well-prepared, teach the principles and give us time to practice the skills because of their fine preparation in the very thing we've talked about. Appreciate your feedback on this, brethren.
Well done, Brother Valinga. Thank you to you and your group. It's impressive how well you and your group has been responding to these ideas. I've found that once the what has been decided, the how almost comes naturally. After decisions have been made about the whats and hows to train, we are ready to implement the training. Now, we are not going to spend any time today talking about this because what happens here is really just the carrying out of your plans. Let us rather move to the next step, and that is to determine if the training has had the desired impact. We want to know again if the gap between our expected performance and our actual performance has been narrowed as a result of our training. An important guideline written in the Administering Appropriately Handbook reminds us to complete our training by evaluating its effectiveness. For training to be complete, leaders and teachers should evaluate whether the training has fulfilled the intended objectives or goals. Evaluating the impact of training is a necessary step in the training cycle. And after individuals participate in training, assessment based upon the objectives should again be conducted to evaluate the impact of the training. Individuals and leaders should use follow-up assessment to answer questions such as the following. What impact has training had on the individual's knowledge, performance, attitude, or character? In what ways has training influenced the way the individual lives, teaches, or administers? How well are individuals prepared to fulfill the duty or responsibility addressed in the training? Brother Valinga, could I ask if you would please take a few moments to discuss this concept with your in-service group?
Certainly, thank you. Brethren, now that we've done some training, how have you evaluated the training that's been provided? Could you, Brother Lotulele?
I think one effective way to start is to go back and look at the stated purposes and perhaps the articulated objectives that the group has come together to decide that these are the objectives that we want to accomplish at the end of the training. So you go back to that to begin or to start evaluating what had happened.
Good, thank you. Brother Vallis?
I think this evaluation is very important. You know, we talk about when we're teaching our students, are we teaching a lesson or are we teaching our students? And I think the same principle is important for our in-service trainers to realize we're not just teaching an in-service lesson, but we're teaching teachers. And to follow up is part of that teaching. To go to them afterwards and say, did that help? How has that helped you? Do you need some more help in that area? Or observing their teaching and seeing if it helped, if they're able to learn and implement the skills or principles that were taught. So I think that follow-up with them, and even with their students again, just to see if those changes were made and if it helped.
Now, you're a seminary principal right now, and what is one way that you make that assessment of that as you evaluate that training? What's one thing that you do specifically in your building?
I think some of the things that we do to start off our assessment, those same things again, you know, talking to the students, evaluating the teachers, you go into the classroom, even talking to parents again and priesthood leaders, and some of those assessment things again, redoing those helps you to evaluate, if your in-service training has been effective or not.
Okay, very well. Brother Webb?
I think it's important to remember that change takes time. It's important to follow up, but I don't know that we can always expect just because we said it in a meeting that everyone's going to immediately understand this standard. And so I think we continue to teach and work with and be patient as people change. The other thought I have just with that, I think it was some time ago now, but Brother Anderson talked about from the Administering Appropriately handbook that we need to assess, is it understanding, is it performance, is it attitude, is it character? And I think we come back to that idea a little bit that we've now trained, but what have we trained? Have we trained for understanding? Have we trained because the performance level there? And then to say, okay, now we've done a good job to help them understand what the standard is, but maybe we need to go back and train performance, or maybe they understand it and for some reason they're hesitant to make those changes. Maybe they're just, you know, a little bit, whatever attitude is causing them to not want to make those changes. And maybe we need to reevaluate what's the objective, how close have we come, are we going in the right direction, and what else do we need to look at by way of reasons for the gap.
Thank you. The Lord is patient with us, isn't He? Are there other things to consider, brethren, in evaluating training?
It seems like that if, for an example, an area training council develops and decides what to train and how to train, that once the training is delivered, that same area training council ought to get together and counsel together about whether or not it was effective. Does that make sense? The person or persons that planned the training ought to get back together and discuss and talk about, and did we meet the objective? What could we have done better? And how will we take what we've learned in this particular setting and improve our training in the next opportunity that arises?
It's a great comment. So can I follow that up with a question? How have you or any of you been successful in evaluating training that you have done? Can you give any examples?
Unfortunately, I could probably give more examples that I failed in this, and so this has been good for me to stop and think,
Excuse me.
how can we fix this and correct this? Because there's a lot of things here that, you know, you assume that you're doing all right, and then you look at really what's expected and how well we could be doing, and there's a gap in our training, I guess, in some ways. And so, I don't know, I didn't mean to give a bad example, but...
That's okay. Brother Vallis?
I'm excited to do better as well, but I know at the first of the year I have 8 teachers in our building, and I've asked them all to write down some goals that they have for the year and areas that they'd like to work on and how I can help. And as we go through the year and have had some training, we've tried to address those needs, and I asked them halfway through, again, you know, ask them again. What are your goals? What are your needs? You know, how are we doing? And I was able to assess how I did as an in-service trainer in helping them with original goals. And it'd be good at the end of the year to maybe ask that again and get their responses and their feedback. And that may be, you asked for an example of something I've done, and that's something that came to mind.
Thank you. Could I ask one final question, brethren? As we've talked about this whole circle of assessing where we stand based on the standards that we've been given, and then deciding what it is we train, how we train it, and then how we evaluate it. How do you feel when you see one that you're responsible to serve, where there's a gap in performance, and you've seen that gap close? What's happened? Can you think of an experience, without sharing the experience, but your feelings once you've seen the gap start to close? Brother Vallis?
I had an experience with a teacher who had some issues that he was struggling with, and some students were concerned with, and even some parents. And as he worked on those, and we talked and communicated, and he addressed those and was able to correct some things. And he was so excited because he noticed the difference, and the students noticed the difference. And it was an amazing thing, and it affected his teaching overall. And it was a neat thing that I was very excited about as well. But it was neat to see his excitement as he improved.
Thank you. It's a great blessing and joy when we see performance improve for the good of our students and for the happiness of the employee. This is Heavenly Father's work. and He loves to see all of us succeed together. And I'm grateful for your participation today, and pray that Heavenly Father will bless us and help us to be unified in our effort to help all those who we serve to be effective teachers and administrators in the church educational system.